I wanted to talk about the kind of plusness, the need for a plus. Thank you. The need for a plus in South Australia, the need for a plus in Australia, I think. But I wanted to start with thinking about the difference between data and evidence. When we think about data and evidence, sometimes we put them together and we use the terms interchangeably. I want to think about them as two different beasts, two different things. I want to get some clarity around the difference between data and evidence. And when I look on my phone at the Macquarie Dictionary app, that tells me that data is about figures and statistics that are known or available. It's about the information that we've got. But when we look at the definition of evidence, that's about something that makes things evidence, an indication or a sign. And so when Rod was talking earlier about that tracking and monitoring so that we know our students, so that we know our learners in order to develop our plans and priorities, we're really talking about evidence, aren't we? We're really talking about that indication or a sign. And so sometimes we slip into talking about being data-driven. And I think that's a nonsense, really. I think it's a mistake if we were to do it, and I don't think we really mean data-driven. I think what we mean is evidence-based or evidence-informed, taking the indicators that we've got, understanding them, those things that make things evident, that indication or a sign. We're going to take those indications and signs. And of course, data is a really strong, data are a really strong way of getting some of that evidence and getting some of that indication. But if we just take the data on its own, we can end up in some really strange places, and places I think that we don't want to be. And when I was looking for a kind of description of this, I actually found the best one in an article from the Harvard Business Review, and they were talking about how the value of data isn't the data. And what I've done is I've taken some quotes from this and I've replaced where it says business with something about education. Let me show you what I mean. So in this, they talk about how evidence-based decision-making isn't just a fad. It's the future of how we're going to guide. And of course, they were talking about business, and I've replaced that with education. So I've highlighted it in the text. That's me changing it to give us an education analogy. But let's be very clear. There's a distinction to be made, just as we've done, between evidence and data. Because the former, the evidence, is the end game for understanding where your partnership has been and where it needs to go, where you want it to go. But the latter, the data, is the instrument that allows us to get to that end game. And to talk about the confusion here being understandable, because they're talking business about this moving from what they call the Wild West world of the shoot from the hip decision making. It's probably overdoing it a bit, but that more kind of experiential, perhaps, kind of gut feel decision making that can be put off by all kinds of different things, making it into a more evidence-based model. We need that. We need the data. That evidence really needs to come from the data and the way that we interpret the data. But your starting point, as it says, has got to be your story, the story itself, because that defines what information you need. That defines the kinds of analysis that you're going to do with the data that you've got. How are you going to look at the data? How do you know how to look at the data? Which way are you going to look at it? Well, that depends on your story. That depends on your partnership story. And of course, your partnership story will be informed by the national story, the state story, some of the site stories. But your partnership story is really that starting point, of course. And as it says, that the data really is just the instrument that you're going to use to do that. And if we use an example, here's the AFL stats from last year. We've got the players and we're looking at the top of the table, and we've got the number of kicks, the handballs, the disposals, and so on, the total for the season, the average per game, and so on. And that's data, but it's not really evidence. What are you going to do with it? This misses the big picture. If you were to pick your team, you probably could just pick out, from the top your team, and you probably do pretty well. But actually, when you look at the whole thing, if you were picking a team, there's a whole host of other things that you bring to it. There's a whole host of other criteria. You'd look at this in different ways. You'd be organising the data in different ways. But if you just looked at the data, you really would be missing the big picture. You get lots of information, but it might be useless. You could pick the top few and put those into a team, knowing that they're not a very good team and they don't work together. We see those those teams of performers being outperformed by a high-performing team. That difference between those two, because we know what a team is and we bring that together, we bring our professional judgment to it, and we make sure that we hold on to the big picture of what we're trying to achieve. So back to this article in the Harvard Business Review, really what they were talking about was it's our story that defines the data that we need. And our story is informed by, as I say, the state story, our site story. We will define our partnership's story. And that defines the data that we need. And then when you do the analysis, it's going back to this point about the kinds of analysis that we'll do. Once you've got this story, once you've got this system configured, what actually happens is it runs in the other direction. Because now you're getting data and you're going to analyse it in the way that gives you some evidence about your story, about where you've been, where you are, where you want to get to. And then that starts to inform, back to what Rod was saying before, those four aspects that we were talking about. Of course, that tracking, but then our plans and priorities, our strategies. What is it that's going to help us to achieve this goal that we've got? And so thinking about how that's reflected in our pedagogy and the pedagogical development that we might do on our sites and the intervention that's required for individual students and groups of students. And so starting with our story, I think, is really important. And if we don't do that, we fall into all kinds of strange places. And we get into things like data blindness. And I want to share with you some examples of this. Here's the 2006 PISA science scores. So in 2000 PISA, looking at our 15-year-olds all around the world, and they do science, numeracy, science, mathematics, and reading every time they do it, every 3 years. And each time there's a focus on one on the other. And 2006 was science. And so what we've got here are the science scores ranked in order. And at the top, we've got the lowest performing country, so Kazakhstan, Qatar, Azerbaijan up there. Going through, here's the OECD average, and then what we see at the bottom is the higher performing countries. Who is the highest performing country? Finland, yes, okay, we know. There's Australia. Australia's actually not there. Okay, so the first thing to say is Australia's not there, because there's no statistically significant difference between a whole bunch of countries here. So Australia's not there. It's with others, but it's not quite so far away from Finland as that makes it look. And so when we look at this, of course, what happened around the world was people went, wow, what are they doing in Finland? Let's go to Finland and have a look. And lots of people went to Finland and had a look at what they were doing in Finland. And so high achievement, according to PISA's definitions of achievement, meant that Finland looked really good. But then when you start to ask questions about, but what really matters? Is it performance? Yes, performance really matters. But what else is it? What else do we want from our students? How does science contribute to, yes, our performance culture, intellectual culture, but also, so we've got to do well at that. But also, what about the kind of engagement of students? What about the students' interest in science? And what's really interesting about the 2006 PISA data is that when they plotted science score, so across the bottom here, what we're looking at is the performance of the students against the interest in science, as defined by PISA. Of course, what we've got down here is this is the low score, low interest zone. So if there were countries down here, these would be kids who were not interested in science and not doing very well at science. Up here is the high score, high interest group. So the kids, that would be the countries where the kids are really interested in science and performing well. So what does the data look like? The opposite to what we thought it was going to look like. We'd assumed that the kids who had low interest would have low score. But it turns out there's a pretty strong relationship where the places that have got low score have actually got the highest interest. And the places that have got the highest interest have actually got the lowest score. That's a bit weird. And so now when you look at that as an indicator, have a look at where Australia is. So all the high scorers, or lots of the high scorers, are down at this end where we're scoring high, but we've got low interest. Look at where Finland are. The highest performers in the world and the lowest interest in the world. The absolute rock bottom of interest in the world. So now for me the question becomes, oh my God, what are they doing in Finland? What are they doing to the kids? And of course the question becomes, where do we want to be? Where on this scale do we want to be? What's our story? Do we want to be high performing at the cost of interest? Where's the balance for us? Where's the kind of zone on this chart where we want to be? And if we try and improve and we focus on achievement and performance, and so we set off in that direction of improving achievement and performance, the problem is that we might go in a different direction. We intend to improve performance. We will focus on results. And in focusing on results, actually what happens is we get this drop in interest, let's say. We see that around the world, that if you set off in that direction, the ones who get better and better, there's a relation in terms of performance. There's a relationship with interest that means that maybe we will go in this direction. So the way that we look at the data, the way that we look at the evidence, might get us to ask some questions about our plans and priorities, about our strategy, about which way we're going to set off it, about then our pedagogies in our classrooms. Maybe we want to set off in a different direction. Maybe we want to set off in a direction that has a focus on results, but it also has a focus on interest as well. That we go off in that direction, that we think about that as a strategy, that we think about our pedagogies in those ways, and we might go in a different direction again. We might not end up where we wanted to be, but we would end up in a healthier place here, perhaps, than down here. The direction in which we set off in depends upon our interpretation of our data and the way that we turn that into evidence. And so now, of course, the other questions that we might have is, well, who's not on that line? Who is got higher interest than they should have for their performance, or have got higher performance than they should have for their level of interest? What you start to see is now that back in 2006, Hong Kong was starting to stand out. And of course, we've seen that come through more and more now in the data that's come out through that. I asked colleagues in Hong Kong who I work with on some projects about, why do you think you're out there? And they talk about the culture that they've had. So the influence of the Chinese culture and the European culture coming together, a whole host of things about what's going on in families, what's going on in schools. But really saying, it's actually about hundreds and thousands of years of Chinese culture behind them. Which is a bit disappointing, right? Because how are we going to do that? But we could ask, what are they doing in Hong Kong? But look, where else? Portugal are sitting right off this line. Way up there. They're not performing very well, but they're sitting right up off the line. Who's ever heard of anybody looking at the PISA data and saying, what are Portugal doing? Because we get focused, we get our data blindness, we focus on the performance, we focus on the results only. What we've seen is you end up in a strange place where it doesn't tell you how to plan and prioritize. It doesn't tell you how to interpret the data and think about things in different ways. Think about what our story is. It tells you what your story is. And so, I'm not suggesting that we go to Portugal, although that wouldn't be a bad thing. But I'm not suggesting that I'll rush off to Portugal and see what they're doing in Portugal. But it's a different question to ask. It's a different way of thinking about the data, I think. And so, of course, now what I'm thinking about is, if that PISA science score is one indication of results of achievement, what else? This is PISA interest, but what else could be there? If this is the results, what else is there? What else could we be thinking about? And should we be thinking about other things? Of course, in our strategic plan, we've been thinking about engagement, equity. We've been thinking about the nature of challenge and how we challenge kids and what challenge looks like. And we've talked in some of the partnerships about, challenge being about a tough question that just filters the kids. The example that some of you will heard me talk about is, if you ask kids what's the capital of South Australia, depending on their age and a whole host of things, but lots of the kids will know what the capital of South Australia is. If I ask them what's the capital of West Bengal, I know, asking that question, that few of them are going to know the answer, unless somebody's told them the answer. Few of them are going to know the answer. It's a harder question, but only because it's a filtering question, only because it's got inequity built into it. And of course, if I go to West Bengal and ask those kids what's the capital of West Bengal, they'll all know. What's the capital of South Australia? None of them will know. It's not a fundamentally more challenging question. It's just a filtering question. It's just a you know it or you don't kind of question. So the nature of challenge And how do kids see challenge? How do kids respond to challenge? Might be, another one of our axes, another thing that we would think about beyond the results. So I think thinking beyond the results can help us to get better results, because what we're seeing over and over again is that you don't necessarily get better results by driving for better results if you have that one-dimensional view of it. And so, so there's a question for us. If we think about the beyond the results, which direction would you set off in? Which things are you going to value? What would your chart look like? How many dimensions are you going to have to your chart? But what would that look like, and which direction are you going to set off in? And so, you could be data driven. I think, our response to the kind of PISA score was, here's the data, Finland is scoring the highest, what are they doing in Finland? And then getting a bit more nuanced and being a bit more strategic and more informed and looking at it through our stories about what we want to achieve. So thinking about, what's our story, and then using that to develop our strategic approach. What's your partnership story? What's the South Australian story? And what's your partnership story?